Literature Prize was found in Willbess Group, and the person named one of the 100 Nobel Prize by the New York Times Book Review, one of the 100 most read books of the year. Her novel, The Rose of Apology, was long listed for the joint title of the prize in the Charles Fields Award for Fiction and a finalist for the National Book Critics Award for Fiction in California Book Award for Fiction. Her novel, a finalist for the National Book Critics Award for Fiction. So please welcome me and welcome you.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us. Iris and I are good and old friends, so it's wonderful to spend this time together talking about this wonderful novel. We're going to start with Iris giving a reading from The Lion's Den.
Thanks, Namwali, and thanks, Nazareth, for that pretty long. I thought I spent a lot of time in school, but I think Namwali might have beaten me. So yeah, thank you all for being here. It really is such a pleasure to spend time with you. And I'm going to do a little bit of a reading and just want to set the stage a little bit. The story is about two protagonists. The first is Grace, who is a very, very passionate, determined lawyer, rookie lawyer, who will go to the ends of the earth for her client. And the other protagonist is her client, who is Willbess Bessy Mulenga. And Bessy has been charged and is imprisoned for crimes against the order of nature, which is the Zambian penal code for same-sex relations. And so this part of the book is where the government is now going after Grace in the press for defending Bessy. And this is the conversation at her law office with Mavuto, her ne'er-do-well office mate. Grace sat at Mavuto's desk and read the article he had pointed out to her in the national paper, Disbar Disgrace. In it, she was described as the devil's lawyer, promoting homosexuality and turning Lusaka into Sodom and Gomorrah. Grace checked the newspaper from cover to cover, but there was no mention of the anti-government protests at all, only fetching pictures of KK waving his white handkerchief, visiting a spruced up wing of the University Teaching Hospital. Does everybody know who KK is? Okay. Oh, I love this crowd. Okay. Grace didn't recognize it, as it was the same University Teaching Hospital that she had just visited. The police fired tear gas and were beating people up. We have no idea how many people got hurt or arrested or if anyone was killed. It's like the protest didn't happen at all, Grace said to Mavuto, who was tapping golf balls down the lane between their desks. He paused and without looking up from his putter said, when the Times of Zambia ran an article about the miners protesting on the Copperbelt, the editor was fired. Oh, and remember, last year when that idiot Lieutenant Luchembe got drunk, took over the government radio station and played reggae until the police dragged him out? That's actually a true story. Everyone at the station got fired for their involvement in the so-called coup. Controlling the media is repressive regime 101. Grace nodded. She shouldn't have been surprised. It was a government-owned newspapers. All the news outlets were. And this picture makes me look like a this picture looks like a mugshot. She had never seen the photo before, but she remembered it being taken during her registration at university, her first few days in Lusaka. The photographer had asked her to smile, and she, indignant at the suggestion, had refused. In the village, a photo was a serious event, where everyone dressed in their Sunday best stood still and looked at the camera with a sober expression. Eventually, Grace learned that in Lusaka, one was supposed to look happy in photos, and Grace would shout, cheese, along with everyone else when a camera was pointed in her direction. In this picture, her eyes looked worried and uncertain, and her hair was cropped close to her skull. She remembered using a razor blade on her head because the boys in school seemed to bother her less, the more she looked like a boy. She recognized the collar of the shirt as her old school uniform that she had worn until Susanna, her university roommate, gave her new clothes and tossed her old ones over the balcony. She touched the neat bun of her hair and then ran her fingers down the fine fabric of her new suit. It was her in the photo, of course, but she found the image disconcerting. like a snake happening upon his old dead skin.
Thanks. Thank you so much for that reading. So I wanted to start by giving you an opportunity to talk a little bit about how you came to this story, or how did the story come to you? What is its origin, and what made you decide that you wanted to spend those 9 years, unfolding the implications of it in the form of this novel?
I mean, one, I have to be honest, I did not know it was going to take me 9 years. If I probably would not have started on this wild endeavor had I known. I think some of it was being a bit naive. I think sort of seeing people like you, oh, well, and Namwali wrote a book. I mean, surely I can write a book too. So yeah, I mean, part of it was that sort of belief that I could do this thing, and not a real understanding of how hard it is to write a book, which I came to know pretty soon. But the inspiration for the story was actually a photo and a story in a newspaper a long time ago. I think it was the Post newspaper, which was one of the few independent ones. And it had a picture of this kid who had been beaten up in the market square for wearing a dress. And the article described the kid, was clearly a kid, as a boy wearing a dress through the market square. And it was very, very much about how this kid had provoked the mob. And in almost that he deserved to be beaten up because he was, walking through. And at that time, in the 80s, when I was coming up, it was quite common for sort of mobs to attack especially young folk. If you're wearing a dress that they considered too short or revealing, they'd beat you up. If you were, obviously, for this kid. And that story stuck with me. I was thinking, who would be this kid's defender? And I was actually a lawyer at the time, and I was like, well, why wouldn't I be this kid's defender? And just thinking, in the society, which is definitely very homophobic, trying to figure out how this could actually happen, and channeling my ideal self into the character Grace, who is so much more brave than I could ever be, and really is kind of one of the reasons who I thought I would be when I went into law school. And then when you do go to law school, you become kind of a grown-up, and you think about, oh, I've got to pay for this, I've got to get a job, I've got to do all these things, and all your hopes and dreams about becoming a human rights lawyer sort of disappear slowly. And so it was a bit of a revival of my old self and who I might have been if I had been brave enough to take a different path.
So you're saying that you saw this article a couple of decades ago.
Yeah, I mean, it stayed with me. It haunted me.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask. Like, what made it haunt you, and what made it the case that you wanted to follow? Like what was urgent about it for you?
Well, there was no identifier of this kid, and I don't know what happened. There was no legal case. There was just this story about the kid who walked through the market. And so it was that was kind of the seed that was planted in my mind, and thinking like, well, I haven't done anything. Who else in Zambia would be doing something? And you find there are very few people, and you talk to other lawyers, and there's a real lack of empathy, sympathy. And then there are laws actually which are criminalizing love. And that sort of the combination of these things swirling were the beginning of a book, that and then the madness that I spoke about before, which made me think, oh, I can write that book. I should write that book. And Toni Morrison said,
if you want to read it, you have to write it.
Yes, exactly. And I hadn't found any book that was like this, exactly like this, and talking about a young woman who was defending LGBTQ character. It was a different perspective. And my hope is that everybody will think of themselves as a defender of others who are facing discrimination.
And so does the immediate thought, who would defend this person? And you were at that time a lawyer. Is that why it's the genre of a legal thriller? Was there ever another possibility in your mind of what other kind of novel it could be?
I mean, initially I thought maybe I could write the story from the perspective of Bessy.
Yes, I was wondering about that.
But I also knew I'm not qualified to do that. And there are others who are, and they are doing it, and they're doing it well.
Yeah.
But this is a different story. This is about all of us and about discrimination and we've all experienced discrimination in some shape or form. Everybody here, I think maybe there's no white males here. Maybe they have not experienced it, but all of us have certainly experienced it. And I think one of the tactics that is used is really a divide and conquer. You know, whether it's Black people, Jewish people, you know, people of South Asian descent. I mean, there is always a sense of almost a protected space and zero sum. Whereas if we all are just intolerant of intolerance, we will get so much further.
And when you were thinking about writing Grace's journey, I'm very interested in how you chose to deepen her story, give us this background to where she's coming from, right? So we get some aspect of Bessy's life, her home life, or his home life. I'm not sure yet what pronoun, you know, the character would have chosen, because we weren't in that era then.
No, so just to be clear, the book is set in the late 80s, early 90s. And so the language was very different and probably still in Zambia. It has not evolved. And so that was actually a conversation that I had with one of my editors who had wanted me to change the language to make it more appropriate for this time. And I was like, well, I can't, because it's set in a very particular space and time and place. And even in Zambia now, the homophobia is intense. It is strong. It is alive and well.
Yeah.
And so even if the story were set today in Zambia, it still would not be, I don't think it would feel right for the story to use different pronouns than he for Bessy.
Yeah. Well, that makes me want to ask a slightly different question, but we'll get back to Grace's journey. I want to ask about this revelatory uncovering, right, of a whole aspect of Zambian society that is still suppressed, is still kept secret. And I have two questions. One is, how could you research something that is so silenced, right? What did you do in order to get into the life and the kind of energy of this community? And the other question that I have is, you know, did you feel trepidation? Were you worried or concerned about exposing a part of Zambian life that people still disavow?
I mean, I think those are really good questions. I sort of approached it in a slightly different way, from the things that I see and the things that I know and the things that I hear. And channeled the feelings of being discriminated against and othered, which I think are quite universal. I did talk to a couple of folks who I know, Zambian, who, you know, kind of what I'm close to, but I would say that most of it was more in my own imagination. And I don't think it's giving away too much to say that Bessy disappears very early. He has disappeared very early in the story. And so we only see glimpses of him from the perspective of other people, his family most notably. And there you can also, it's very accessible. Family members feeling conflicted and confused. They love their child. Bessy's mother, that's, you know, Bessy is her favorite child. She loves him. She's scared for him. And she tries to protect him, but not in the right way. She tries to protect him by changing him. And that's something that she struggles with. And then the siblings, each of the siblings also have slightly different reactions and levels of understanding. And so I wouldn't say, I mean, Bessy is a little bit mysterious.
Yeah.
To me. But the pieces that I did show, I wanted to be sure that he is a lively person. He's a beautiful person. He bursts off the page when he's on the page.
Yeah.
And you want to know him, which makes you want to root for him until the very end.
Yeah. So, and then the other question was whether you were hesitant at all, or if you had any fears or trepidation about it. I mean, you've done gender-based equality work in a space that remains pretty patriarchal. So I imagine that your courage was there, but I'm just curious about, what sorts of responses you got from people at home, and what you felt about this, again, the urgency of this project of actually opening up these questions that are lurking.
I mean, I think writing is a different process. I think you have to divorce yourself from fear or thinking about what a reader, if you ever have the honor and privilege of having readers, you can't worry about that. Otherwise, you will just never write your story. So I wasn't even thinking about that at all. I was really thinking about the characters and they're courageous characters themselves.
Yeah.
And so they kind of give you the courage. I mean, it sounds a bit bonkers, because these characters become almost like real people. They are like real people in my own mind. And they're so brave. They encourage you to be a little bit brave. And the reality is, I mean, I live in the US. I am quite protected. I am privileged. And so I feel like I should use that privilege for something good. But the response in Zambia has been very disappointing. I was home not so long ago, and before I went home, there was a book club, a pretty big book club that was very excited and enthusiastic on the back of Namwali. Like, well, Zambian women and gaining ground in literature and putting the country on the map and all this wonderful stuff. Not realizing, I didn't realize that they had no idea what the book was about. And so when they found out what the book was about, it was like, yes, I know we said we could host something, but actually we can't because of what the book is about. I'm like, you guys are a book club. It's not that serious, right? And they were like, no, it is that serious because people are afraid. They work for government or they work for NGOs and they are in communities and they don't want to be directly associated through hosting. If somebody else hosts, we can extend the invitation and see who comes, but we don't want to be a host. And that happened twice. There was another organization, an NGO, that had planned to host something with an embassy. And the embassy, I can say this, I think it was the US Embassy. The US Embassy, similar thing, took a look and said, no, thank you. Mainly because a few years ago, the ambassador actually got tossed out of Zambia because he had made public comments around a particular case where two men had been accused under the same law.
Which is still on the books.
It's still on the books. It's still on the books, and there's no effort or energy around changing it. And it's a stain. It's horrendous. But across the continent, the laws are getting more repressive, not less. So there was a lot of hesitation because there are consequences. The beautiful thing was a different embassy came forward and hosted me and some members of the community who came to a secret location. It was a bit,
Wow.
yes, to have a conversation. And I was really moved at how many felt so thankful and grateful to tell their story.
Mm.
I felt a little bit humbled, very humbled, that they were reading so much into the book and that they were so delighted and proud to have been represented in the book, which made me delighted and proud.
I mean, there's this wonderful moment of connection that Grace feels with Bessy when she first meets Bessy. And I'm wondering if you would read that for us, because I think it speaks to what you're saying about the way that for you, this is the imperative, is to help others, right? But also that it's happening through this kind of connection, through this kind of communication, which is what the book is doing as well, right? So I think that you know the scene I'm talking about.
Yes, let me see if I can find it. I think I did mark it.
It's just in chapter 2, I think.
The boy started to shiver despite the heat, and tears spilled out of his good eye. Grace handed him her handkerchief, and as he took it, their eyes met for a split second. She jolted in her seat as if an electric shock had run through her body, and for a moment, she felt the full force of the boy's anguish and terror. Grace had a strong urge to hold Willbess, to comfort and reassure him, and reassure him that she would save him from this wretched place, and that everything would be all right. She even reached out to touch him, but his hands were already in his lap. Grace searched his broken face again to be certain that she didn't know him. But as she tried to understand the sudden, strong instinct to protect him that felt more primal than lawyerly, perhaps she identified with the suffering so clear in his one good eye, or perhaps it was the recognition that their lives were equally precarious and only the thinnest invisible line put Grace on this side of the table of misfortune and Willbess on the other. Grace shook off these strange sensations, reminding herself that she was there as his lawyer. She drew a sharp breath before she spoke while glaring at Officer Lungu. You have the right to speak to your lawyer in private, and you have the right to be treated with human dignity. The police have no right to beat you up. She glanced back at Willbess. They will answer for this.
Yeah, that moment, and it comes so early in the novel, but it forges this immediate bond between the two of them, even though, as you say, he's disappeared shortly thereafter. And so this feeling of obligation, responsibility, this protective instinct still follows Grace, even though, right, she's not physically with him for the remainder of the
No,
novel.
they are inextricably bound from that moment on to the very end and beyond.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking a little bit about this wonderful description of being both equally precarious, and whether you feel that that is a kind of basis for that bond, a basis for that solidarity.
For sure,
Yeah.
for sure. And this is sort of speaks to what I was saying before, that, you know, Grace has suffered mightily. She comes from a poor background, rural. She's a village girl. She had to fight her way to get educated. She had to, you know, fight off the boys. She had to fight with her mother against societal expectations to get to university, to get through university. And she finally gets this degree. So she has struggled and suffered and been discriminated against, you know, from the time she was born. And so she really believes in human rights, as do I. I mean, human rights, if you are a human being, you have these inalienable rights. However, the fact of the matter is, these things don't just happen. We need to fight to protect them. And even in this country, you know, we're seeing rights that we thought were inalienable, right? These rights have been eroded. 50 years of Roe v. Wade, and it's gone. And this conversation is very much alive.
Yeah.
And so, you know, whichever way we look at discrimination and oppression and vulnerability, we are all in that place and space at some point. And even if we're not, we have an obligation to fight for our humanity. I really feel that way. And I think that's something that Grace really sees in everybody, but especially Bessy. Bessy is even more vulnerable than her. And I think she is shocked to see that and understands that, well, this is why she became a lawyer. This is her reason for being, not just a profession, but this is her reason for being.
What's interesting is by setting up this connection, this sense of responsibility that cannot be fulfilled because Bessy has disappeared, it means that Grace goes on this journey, and the kind of corruption that would lead to Officer Lungu beating Bessy up goes all the way to the top of government, right? And so I'm interested in how you decided to think about this single case and this single moment of very, very personal, almost as you say, primal connection, leading to this much bigger political scandal, right? And then you have, you know, crowds of people supporting Bessy, right? And so I'm curious how you designed that for yourself, or how you thought that through that.
I mean, I think that's how discrimination and oppression works. It's not just one individual or a few evil people. These are systems. And that was what's really interesting to me in my work, but also in, you know, to explore in the book.
Yeah.
And they all conspire together, you know, whether it's government, law, policy, religion, society, all of these align together to keep the status quo. And there are winners in that system. A few winners, and the most people are losers. But they are powerful and they fight. And so that's really interesting to me. Like, how does it happen? How does discrimination happen in this day and age and at the time of the novel? But it's still a problem.
Yeah.
And how do we fight? We fight it by understanding the root cause of the problem. And it's not the one-on-one, you know, jerk that you meet in the office, or, you know, the small microaggression that you might experience. These are systems, and we're seeing this. We're seeing the fight. And, you know, I think now there's some sophistication, at least when we're looking at gender equality, trying to track the money. And it is shocking.
Yeah.
There are hundreds of millions of dollars being pumped into this intentionally to maintain the status quo.
Yeah.
So that to me is kind of how it becomes much more of a intractable. This is why we have not solved the problem of discrimination.
Yeah.
These things are systemic and they are well funded. There are people who really want to keep it the way it is. And I think we need to get a little bit smarter and understand the problems and interrogate and just keep on pushing, you know, or peeling the layers and fighting it layer by layer by layer. And that's what Grace in her journey, she's very, very naive. As she starts her journey, she has no idea what she's up against. But she learns through time and through the journey, like, wow, every time she kind of feels like she's made a bit of a breakthrough, another setback, another layer, another system to fight.
Yeah, I mean, it is gendered in the book, I think accurately, right? This is a very male world that she's navigating, and she comes into contact with a kind of series of figures, like a gauntlet, right? And they have various levels of authority that are, you know, kind of blocking her, but also harming her, right? So she gets subject to the same kind of violence that Bessy does as she tries to find out what is actually behind all of this. But I was also interested in the fact that many of her mentors and the father figures in her life are men as well, right? So you have Abaristo, and you have DB, and you have Mr. Patel, right? And so there's this sense of, navigating this men's world, but without a sense of who you can trust, So I was interested in how you perceive Grace's gender journey in terms of equality as she's fighting the system.
So Grace is very much alone. And, thinking back to the time when I was a young lawyer, it was normal. We were in a class of like 40, and there were 5 of us that were women. And so as we graduated and went on our way, it was normal. You go to work and there it's all men. You go to the courts, it's all men. And you're subject to all sorts of craziness. Now that I look back, I literally shudder because, it was just so overt, the sexism, the harassment, all these things. It was out there. It's not even like today where it's still out there, but a little bit more, where people are slightly more sophisticated and they're not going to make these statements, right in the middle of the office in front of everybody, which is what it was like.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to just capture what it was like to be that single lone person in this sea of men and masculinity, and how difficult it is for her, and how difficult it is for many people. We can sort of bring that today to some of the work I'm sure that we do. Oftentimes, if you're a person of color, you will walk in and you're the only person of color, you're the only one. And sometimes you will go into a space and you'll be the only female and person of color and immigrant, So, it really makes the journey more difficult, but that's the reality. These are the challenges that she had. She was facing her own discrimination, her own demons, her own, navigating the spaces. And as you said, I kind of wanted to make it a little bit interesting because it's not clear when she meets some of the folks, like, is this friend or foe? And you kind of have to get to the end before you can figure out, oh, actually, this is a friend or this is a foe. And it's I played around a little bit with that, somewhat intentionally.
Yeah, that's part of the genre too, right? It's like the twists and turns of the legal thriller. It's wonderful. I wanted to ask about whether, so we've just been talking about how Grace is on Bessy's side of that line in her precarity, in her vulnerability, in her being subject to these gender inequalities, and also these kinds of very explicit forms of violence and oppression. But I was curious about what you say in that very complex passage, which is that she understood that she is actually safer than Bessy in that moment. And what that makes me feel is that there is a real faith in Grace, in the law, in the institutions that she's finding out are deeply corrupt. So I was curious about that. What part of that, access to power or access to institutional authority do you think she can work as a strategy? And also, do you feel that it is the best strategy in the end?
One thing that I remember very, very clearly is when I went into law as a law student, I believed in law and order and justice and the systems. And I put it in the book because, when you're reading the cases, the judges are fair, they're smart, they are on the right side of the law. Otherwise, it's not going to be in your case book, right? And so you watch TV, and justice is propaganda. And justice is served at the end of the day. So you don't really have a good understanding of how legal systems work, but you really believe. That's why you're doing this. That's why you're studying so hard. You're like, I want to be part of this.
Yeah.
And for Grace, because she comes from a poor background, for her, she really feels, I mean, she's fought so hard to get here, to get there. She's like, well, now I've arrived. I'm a lawyer. I have some measure of protection. And she learns pretty quickly that, you know, with Officer Lungu just sees a poor girl. And, you know, as she goes in the world, people can tell she's got like scars on her face, and just, you know, there is like classism as well. So people know from the way she talks, the way she holds herself, the way her accent, they know that she is from a poor background. And so she really has to navigate all of these things, but she comes in with a belief. And I think we've all been there, you know, where you're naive or you just come out of school and you're like, I've got my degree from X university and I'm going to be respected in the workplace and I'm going to change the world, you know, and they're like, can you get me some coffee? You're like, I have a degree, you know? So she really, really is a true believer.
Yeah.
And as she navigates, she does become a little bit more wise to the world. And she does understand, and, you know, she has the help of DB, an older partner at the law firm, who gives her some advice on how she can navigate the legal system to her advantage. But she has to learn that. So in the beginning, she just really thinks that everything is going to work because she's right. And this law is unconstitutional, which it is. How can you have a discriminatory law on the books? That is the fundamental.
Inherited from the British, right?
Yes, it is an inherited law. I mean, insult upon injury. It is an inherited law which continues across the continent.
Yeah.
So it's hard to believe, but yes, this has been carried forward and carried forward. But yeah, Grace has to learn, and she does learn, but she maintains that belief that justice will prevail. If she continues to fight, justice will prevail.
I like that you said she's a true believer, because I wanted to ask about the other organization, system, social, discursive, you know, thread in the book, which has to do with religion, and has to do with her faith. And, you know, what you just described of that kind of slow disillusionment, right? She describes very explicitly when she gets to university, she's taught to ask questions. And when she's taught to ask questions and she's asking God, why poverty and suffering, why starvation and disease? And you have her in this very intimate and warm and generous relationship with a priest, right? As a, you know, again, another father figure, Father Sebastian. So I was interested in how you thought about that aspect of, you know, reconciling your belief with what is actually happening systemically, right?
Yeah, I think this is a journey that, at least for myself, is something I've gone through. I always went to Catholic school. And so, you know, the church has a lot to answer for sure. But trying to untangle what is institutional religion versus belief versus my own relationship with God, and then reconciling that with the world, I think is something that all of us have to go through in some way, shape, or form. And even though Grace is young, you know, her life has pushed her into these really difficult circumstances. She's experienced hunger, like almost near starvation type of hunger. She's seen people die. You know, many people who are close to her in the village, you know, they perish. There's drought, there's floods, there's, you know, cycles of famine and disappointment, and, you know, you work so hard to toil on the land, and then, you know, bloody army worms come and eat everything. You know, these things happen. So she's seen all of that, and she really, you know, goes from a place of absolute faith, which is what the Catholic Church often, at least in those days, just believe in God. This is God's path for you. Have faith. And then she learns that, hey, you know what, I need to question this. I need to understand this. It's not making sense to me. And so she has this relationship with Father Sebastian. And Father Sebastian he is a sort of warm, cuddly guy, but
Yeah.
he is a priest.
Yeah.
And ultimately he sides with the church, the Catholic Church. And she essentially has to part ways with that kind of thinking. And she doesn't abandon her faith, but I think she definitely is on the path to abandoning the church and institutional, the sort of institutional side of religion. She's seen all the bad things that happen.
Yeah.
I mean, her mother as well is, like completely almost radicalized by the church, and Father Sebastian as well. And we see this as in the conversations around homophobia and the conversations I was having with the community. They were saying the thing that hurts most is, yes, there's the law, but what's hardest is the discussions around morality, and that somehow they are immoral people, and those are the things that they have to contend with, in addition to discrimination, in addition to crazy laws that criminalize just basic love, basic human rights.
Yeah.
It's really
I mean,
devastating.
It's making me think that the novel is really about Grace grappling with what she can hold on to of her belief in the law, her faith in justice, and her faith in God, but also putting aside those who would continue to, in a corrupt fashion, oppress others. It's this kind of, and because as you say, she doesn't just, discard her faith altogether in any of these. And the third one that I'd love to hear you talk about, your epigraph and your title are from the book of Daniel. And I was very interested in how, it's about the Daniel and the lion's den, but her totem is a leopard, right? But this, I mean, this is a side of Grace that is really richly and vividly portrayed, which is her relationship to her tribal culture. And, we learn that she's a Wamizimu, Wamizimu, which means she has direct access to the ancestors, right? Would you mind reading from that part? I think it's around 139, 140, or a little bit further in yours, I think.
I have a different version of the book. She has the UK one, I have the US one, so we have to figure out which page it is.
It's in chapter 13.
Okay.
And I think you had marked it. It should be toward the... Yes, there it is. Yeah.
Thanks, I did mark it. Now in the Mulenga's yard, Grace didn't remember hitting the ground, but had the sensation that she was upright. She wiggled her toes, but she couldn't feel anything. She had trouble opening her eyes, but when she did, there it was. It wasn't large or imposing or at all frightening. Rather, its shiny gold coat and black spots across its face and down its back were mesmerizing. She knew that only the most powerful Ngangas had power strong enough to see the spirit escort. But there it was. The leopard looked back at Grace with its intense yellow eyes and pinprick pupils, and switched its tail a few times. With each flick, currents passed across the Ndembo on her face and down her back. She felt it was trying to explain many things that she couldn't decipher.
Yeah, it's this wonderful moment of, again, it felt like a moment of connection that reminded me of her connection with Willbess. And again, it's a kind of moment of protection, but now she's the one being protected, right? And I'm really interested in why you decided to make her a Wamizimu, and what you were trying to get at in terms of her tradition.
I think she's changing and she's growing and she's learning for herself. Everything had been taught to her, including religion. But I think most of us, certainly if you grew up in an African or Zambian culture, there is a lot swirling around. There's a lot of belief in witchcraft. There's a lot of belief in the spiritual world. And it occurred to me, and sort of channeling it through grace, like, why can't these things coexist? And for her, they do. Even though the priest tells her, oh, this is nonsense. It's like, well, why is this nonsense? But, you all are talking about some crazy things too, right? You think about, you start to deconstruct the teachings of religion. I mean, you have to, it's talking about the spirit world. So for her, she starts to understand things for herself, and she starts to trust herself as her confidence and her courage builds. She wants to be the master of her own universe. And this is her coming into her own and realizing that she has her own power and is not going to be defined by the church or by, the law or by the partners. She's coming into her own. And when she starts to do that, then she starts to have these experiences. Before that, she was actually told that she has epilepsy.
Right.
And so she wasn't really able to understand what was happening to her. And so now it becomes clear to her that, hey, you can tell me this, but now I know, I have seen, I have experienced myself. I've had this connection. I've done this thing that I've been told that doesn't happen to anybody, only the most powerful. And guess what? I am the most powerful.
I love that she comes into her authority through this connection to the ancestors, also to the past in that sense, right? But it doesn't have to be filtered through these corrupt, oppressive systems. It's a direct access that gives her her power.
Yeah, and the question is, now will she believe it?
Yeah.
I think we've all had those moments where you're like, yay, I've made it. And then somebody will still come and tell you, no, you ain't shit. And so it's sort of like, that's the question. Will she believe it? Will she own her power and take it forward?
So we have a reputation in Zambia, especially in Zambian literature, for didactic literature and for having some kind of moral message and I think sometimes that makes people misunderstand that there's a politics behind that, right? That there's actually, it's not just a kind of teaching you, how to be, but a way of exploring a different way, right? How to be. And I'm curious what you think about this novel as a political novel, whether you feel that way and whether you had specific aims for its political impact in the world.
It is. I think most books are political in some way, shape, or form. You can read this book and just as a legal thriller and enjoy it at that level. But
And a picture of Zambia.
Yes.
Yeah, like a beautiful picture of Zambia, yeah.
But at its heart, it really is. And that's one of the things I was trying to do, make it a readable, fast-paced story that was talking about serious issues. And so, it sounds like it's very dark and disturbing, and in many ways it is. But there's a number of different levels, and I think it really is a conversation that I want to have with the reader. Obviously I have strong points of view, but through the different characters, I think the opportunity is to meet people where they are and then bring them along. But I think any book, any good book is political. And yeah, I definitely have ambitions, not political ambitions, but
The
last about
election
2
coming up.
minutes. No. Ambitions for the book, especially I think, you know, it was sobering going home, as I said.
Yeah.
But that also made me more determined. Like,
Yes.
okay, now I know, now I'm forearmed. I have to figure out how I'm going to go home and make this thing happen in a big way and make people pay attention
Yeah.
to not just the story, but to these really harmful practices, belief systems, homophobia for sure, laws which are not even our own, all of these things. We need to be able to at least have a conversation. If we can't have a conversation, we're back in an authoritarian government.
Yeah.
Everywhere we go. It applies to all of us, whether you agree or you disagree with how things are happening. Authoritarians will change their mind tomorrow, and it's dangerous for everybody.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's definitely very political.
Yeah. Well, so, you know, having just had this lovely conversation, I think maybe this is a good opportunity for us to open up the conversation to those in the audience, to see if they have questions or things that they want to engage with about the novel.
Yeah, please do. You want to speak into the, because okay.
I just thought it was like really interesting how the story seems to focus on so many different aspects of vulnerability back home. Like, you know, you're vulnerable if you're homosexual, you're vulnerable if you're a woman, you're vulnerable if you come from a less privileged background. But my question was, you know, you talked a lot about how we need to get to the origins, but where do you think that all of these things meet in the psyche that, you know, we've kind of inherited from, as you said, things that aren't indigenously ours, like from colonial masters? Or did you see in a way how this kind of all came together from that?
I mean, it's complex, right? And we're speaking in English, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, you know, it's something that I think at the individual level, we have to untangle. Like, what are the things that we consider progressive? And what are the things that are harmful and regressive? And yeah, keep what we think is good. And that is sort of very individual, but there's some things that I think we can all agree as society are good for society, human rights are good for society, and then reject the things that are obviously bad and harmful and negative. And this is a clear example, but I think there are a lot. And as you said, we have to navigate these things. And some traditions, for example, some traditions are good, but some are harmful. And they need to, you know, their time has passed and we need to move on. We need to say that the time has passed. We need to say why, who they're harming. And yeah, and I think own some of this and claim our power, because these decisions are being made for us, by the way. A great question. Yeah, I lost count, I have to say. And I've always worked full time. So if any of you are writing or write, I know some of you are writers, do not be discouraged. Because you have to be disciplined about it, and it will not take you nice. So it took about 7 years to get the full manuscript ready and out there. And so the process, I mean, it was sort of fits and spurts, you know, sometimes I was writing consistently and other times you kind of get a little bit lazy, and then, you know, Grace would start whispering in my ear like, hey, you know, you haven't finished the story. And I think one of the silver linings of, you know, living through COVID, which is it's an awful pandemic, was I wasn't traveling as much as I usually do. And so I could spend the time to get the manuscript finished. But I think, you know, having a husband who will read hundreds of drafts is helpful. Having good friends who are authors is helpful. But what worked for me was having a small group of writers. There were 4 of us who got together pretty much every month and would read a chapter, each other's chapter, critique it. And that helped in a lot of ways because it A, gave me discipline. B, if I didn't produce my chapter, I still had to read everybody else's chapter. So the house would win and I would feel bitter. So that motivated me. But the feedback was also really good. It was people I trusted and it was immediate. Because I think one of the things about writing, especially if you're writing a book, is it can get lonely and sometimes you can feel a little bit lost. Like, oh, is that beautiful or is it, you know, sappy and stupid? I don't really know. And you need to have somebody to say, no, this is gorgeous writing, or maybe you want to edit this out. You know, so, but just keep, you know, it's the process. You've just got to be disciplined and you've got to get to the end and get your first draft. And then actually I got some really good advice from Namwali. I don't know if you remember this, but one of the things I struggled with earlier was, I think it's sort of like chapter 2 or something like that. I just got stuck and I had so many ideas for the other chapters. And Namali was like, well, you could write asynchronously. And I was like, there was just like a light bulb. I was like, oh, I don't have to solve all the problems of chapter 2 before I go to I can write chapter 5. And I did. And that just felt like this major breakthrough because then I could, once I was able to get through those other chapters, I could come back and I was like, oh, actually, this makes sense. I know why I was stuck. I was stuck because I hadn't quite figured out that part. Now I figured out that part. Chapter 2 is a breeze. So thank you, Namwali.
You're very welcome.
Are you writing a book? Oh,
Keep
good
going.
luck. Persevere.
Yeah, keep going,
Persevere.
Well, I mean, technically, from when I started my first novel to when it was published was 17 years. So yes, it can take a while.
I'm feeling better already.
Oh, good.
Because people are like, 9 years, what the hell were you doing for 9? At least your book is actually a thick book. This one is not. Like, what were you doing? You're like writing a line a year? How is it possible to take 9 years? It's possible. No, but I'm very, very happy to have it out in the world. It makes it extra sweet.
I was going to ask that too, because there's, what you read at the beginning was about journalism, right? And you were about newspapers and how much they affect the political situation. So I was like, yeah, what does fiction give you that a newspaper article wouldn't? And also that's where the story came from, was a newspaper article.
I don't know. I mean, it's all fiction gives you freedom. You can create, you can imagine, you can move history around. You can just do a lot of things that you can't do in, sort of a nonfiction book. And it's fun. You were actually in conversation with all these people. You create a whole world. So it's pretty amazing sometimes. And you can startle yourself, which is an interesting thing as a writer. Some things come out of you and you're like, where did that come from? I do not know. It feels like some sort of, divine inspiration, but it happens. And when you get into the groove, it just feels really good. So I love fiction. I've always loved reading fiction. So it never really occurred to me to write nonfiction. Sure. That's a good question. I don't know. I've been talking about it for a long time. I think all of us say, I want to write a book. And then, you know, at some point in your life, you sort of are like, wow, I've been saying this for a long time, and people's eyes, you know, they kind of roll their eyes like, oh, yeah, Iris and her damn book story is never going to happen. So it's just one of the things I really wanted to do. And this story has been percolating in my mind for a while. And so at some point I was like, okay, you just have to start with writing a page. And you write a few pages, and then you write some more, and you write some more. So yeah, but I love reading fiction. And so it's kind of a bit of a dream to write. And I had told a friend of mine many, many years ago, you know, we were talking about if we had our dream jobs, what would it be? What would you be doing? And I said, I would be writing and I would be teaching. Sounds like somebody's life, but anyway.
But you did teach, you taught at Mwanza.
I did teach, yeah, but like full time. I was always part time, so I'd be writing and I'd be teaching. And her response was, "So what are you doing about it?" And that was like, actually, I have not written anything, and I haven't really, you know, kind of put myself in a position to do teaching seriously. So at least I've done one out of two. So who knows? Watch this space, Namwali.
Can I ask about, do you have any memories of a particular thing that startled you, that surprised you as you were writing?
Yeah, towards the end, you know, in the beginning there is a handkerchief, and it is an item of luxury that Grace could never afford, but she finds it in her secondhand suit that she bought. So she finds this beautiful silk, heavy silk handkerchief, and I had put it in the story as just because I wanted her to have something really pretty and luxurious and different from her life. And then it came back. And you know, people are like, well, that was kind of a clever device. It's like it actually wasn't. It came later. And I don't know why it was this handkerchief that I, you know, I guess dreamed up for her. But it became very important in many ways. There's some symbolism in the handkerchief. And so, you know, it started as a little thing, but that's an example of something that surprised me. And I think just how the story comes together. You know, I'm not one of those people who has, you know, you know, in movies, they always have somebody with this mosaic and they're figuring it out and they're able to draw how everything gets connected. That's not how I did it. It just kind of came together almost organically, maybe magically, but
Through the muse.
it felt like that. It felt like it, you know, when I was done and it worked, I was quite astounded.
I just saw a meme that just feels apropos, which is, you know, sometimes I write something and then I look back at what I wrote and I think, damn, I wrote that. And sometimes I think, damn, I wrote that. And sometimes I'm like, I wrote that. And I feel like that moment of like, oh, how did this come out of me? Such a delectable feeling.
It really is. And also, I mean, you know, sort of to your question, the process is so long and drawn out that by the time the book comes out, you know, you read some parts and you're like, I didn't remember all this detail that I had put in.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad I did it, but you know, you sort of think people assume that you remember every word very intimately, but you know, from the time like your publisher says, yes, we're going to buy the book, and you've gone through all the edits, there's still, you know, 18 months to 2 years, which is a pretty long time, and you're working quite intensely on specific parts where they say there are problems. So you're not like reading the whole book. So there's some parts that you haven't actually read or looked at for a very long time by the time you're having conversations like this. But it is kind of nice to go back and sort of say, yeah, that was a good piece of writing. I'm happy.
That's the damn, I wrote that.
Yeah, the other dams do happen too. But
Are there any more questions from? Yeah.
I think it's being able to have the whole conversation. I don't feel personally that I can't speak my mind in any situation. I think most people will know, if they know me, that I'm inclined, for better or for worse, to speak my mind. But you can't have that long dialogue with a person whose mind is closed. So a book is, I mean, this is the power of books, right? You can have this very long conversation, meandering conversation, with a person who's just reading a story, and they may not realize that this is actually a one-way conversation, but it is. And so I really feel like it's not so much that I can't say what I want to say, but I can't say all of what I want to say to anybody in the same way. And I think this is just the power of storytelling. We can, if we tell a good story, anyone will listen. If we do it right, they will get sucked into the book. Even if it's like, well, I've heard about this crappy novel about something that I totally disagree with. Once they get into the story, they can actually be grabbed and taken all the way to the end. And that's my sincere hope for the story.
And a lot of the novel is staged as a series of conversations, you know, and with people saying the sorts of things that you might hear back home, but then also sometimes with people saying really surprising things, right? You know, I'm trying to remember her name, the landlady that we sort of
Mrs. Njavwa.
Mrs. Njavwa, we sort of dismiss her, and then she comes through with this extremely a kind of key, right, for Grace. And yeah, I think just having, like, even just enacting the kinds of conversations that you want to have in the prose itself, I think is going to draw readers in.
Yeah, and the women are actually quietly powerful.
Yes, I noticed that.
So, you know, it is, you know, patriarchal society, but the women are there. And if you pay attention, the women are actually, they find ways to navigate the system, but it's not in your face. It's really how women do exercise power. They do it in quiet ways so that they can, and that they won't be stopped. And so I wanted to, and it's not always like Grace's mother.
No,
They're not all amazing, wonderful women.
because they're human.
Because they're human, but they are powerful in different ways.
Yeah, Mrs. Banda, and then she has this bestie, Susanna, from university, who is like a kind of, yeah, there's a kind of support there.
Yeah, in a weird way. Somebody was asking me if I was like Grace when I was at university. And I was like, actually, I was more like Susanna. Not the best student in the world, but I mended my ways later on.
Loyal, you know.
Yes, she's a good friend.
Yes.
She's a loyal friend. She's just has a very different upbringing, and
Yeah,
she thinks university is for having fun.
yes. Which it is as well. But yes, I think there is a kind of thread, a subterranean solidarity between women, and between those who suffered the oppression of men, even, we could put it that way.
Agree with that. So.
I think that's us for the evening. Thank you so much for coming out. And thank you, Iris, for writing this amazing book.
Thank you, everybody. It's been so fun. I know it feels like it's very hot in here. I don't know if it's just me, but I'm really, really grateful for each one of you coming out and spending this evening. It always surprises me that anyone comes out, so it feels very, very special to see you, and I'm happy to see old friends and new ones as well. So thank you, everyone.